So today we have part 2 of Naoki Hamaguchi's breakdown of the Nibelheim flashback, where he goes more in depth with how they crafted the combat for Sephiroth and Cloud, and also how, yeah, they did try to incorporate the spiral staircase into the Shinra Mansion, but unfortunately, it didn't work. So starting off first, they talk about Sephiroth and how they wanted to make him a controllable player this time around that felt incredibly powerful. Hamaguchi says, "The way Sephiroth appears in the Nibelheim incident is one of the most famous parts of the original game, and we know that many players had wondered how it would be done in the remake series. I think that when you consider what people would want to see, and perhaps even what they'd expect, it would be disappointing if you didn't get to play as Sephiroth in battle, so making him playable was a natural decision." And I remember leading up to Rebirth, we weren't sure if that was going to happen, because in the original game, Sephiroth is not controllable. He's just this incredibly powerful character with maxed out weapons and materia that just does his own thing, and you are relegated to controlling a fairly weak version of Cloud who can get KO'd in pretty much one hit. So when it was revealed that, yeah, you're gonna be able to control Sephiroth, that was an incredibly exciting moment because, you know, other than like the Dissidia games, I don't know if we've really ever gotten to control Sephiroth in a game. Of course there was Ehrgeiz, God bless the ring, but that's a little bit of a different situation. But I really do appreciate how they crafted Sephiroth because he wasn't super complicated. And Naoki Hamaguchi goes into why he wasn't super hard to control. Hamaguchi says, "Bear in mind, this is essentially the first part of the game, so we felt we needed a character who was easy to control. You should be able to use him fairly intuitively without even watching a tutorial or seeing anything. He should just feel good." He had to feel strong. We had to give the impression that he was fighting on another level to Cloud, so we made his moves really powerful and also very flashy to convey his much greater strength and experience. And I think they did a great job on both of those fronts. If you look at Sephiroth as a character from the very brief section we get to use him, he's not overwhelming to control. He's not confusing. He's not loaded with a bunch of abilities and materia that could overwhelm a new player. He's got 2 abilities to use, 1 synergy skill to use, and then 1 synergy ability, and then like a fairly normal set of materia that most people would be familiar with or are pretty self-explanatory. So he's really the perfect introduction character for a lot of players. And he's also kind of a preview of just how powerful you could become later on in the game. And as for how Sephiroth controls, again, he's incredibly fast and speedy, but super, super powerful. And again, the developers really like to take the story stuff and make sure that it matches the gameplay, and Sephiroth 100%, the tale of this, incredibly powerful soldier who is in a league of his own, I think translates really well into the gameplay. So they did a really fantastic job with crafting Sephiroth and allowing us to use him and letting the player feel rather powerful. Next, they talk about how they crafted Cloud and why they made specific changes to not only his combat, but how they presented him. Hamaguchi says, "Making Cloud more capable was done deliberately. People who have played the original FF7 story understand that the version of Cloud who appears in that scene is not entirely the character that people know. He's misremembering certain aspects, and you can see that in the way he talks, the way he acts, his body language. People who don't know the story should pick this stuff up. We definitely want to communicate to them that this doesn't seem quite right. Why is he behaving so differently to the Cloud we know from 7 Remake, for example? We made some deliberate choices in terms of presentation, but we also wanted to reflect it through gameplay too. He is deliberately much stronger than fans may remember because it's not just Cloud's strength." And again, I'm not really ever sure if the people watching my content have played the original FF7, so again, I like to throw out spoiler warnings here, but obviously in these flashbacks, it's not entirely Cloud. It's a mixture of Cloud remembering certain aspects of Zack, and he's kind of, taking on the persona of Zack, who is this character who is so much more energetic and jovial and upbeat compared to Cloud. So that's why Cloud is acting the way he acts, and I actually really like to go back and watch people's playthroughs who are brand new to the franchise. 7 Remake was their first Final Fantasy, so they're not familiar with the lore of this story. And I love seeing their reactions to Cloud and how he behaves in the flashback because it's always pretty fascinating. And people are like, wait, why is he acting this way? This doesn't feel like the Cloud that we've come to know. And I think just in terms of overall combat for Cloud, they really changed him for the better. So in 7 Remake, Cloud was pretty much just the grounded combat guy. If an air enemy showed up, combat was nowhere near as satisfying with Cloud as it was with someone like Tifa or Barret or Aerith. Cloud would jump into the air, maybe do a couple of strikes, and then he would lose his momentum and then fall to the ground. But in Rebirth, they added so many new mechanics for Cloud to tackle air enemies, so that way he's not just jumping up, hitting a few attacks, and then that's it. He can dodge left and right, back and front, and let out these really powerful blade beam attacks that target grounded enemies as well as enemies that are in the air. He can use his abilities like triple slash to get into the air to then combo enemies and finish with something like Braver. So they really fine-tuned Cloud's combat and made him so much more fun in Rebirth, because in Remake he did kind of get a little bit boring at times because you were essentially just kind of guarding or waiting for the enemy to hit the ground or to be able to switch to a character that could tackle a flying enemy. So they really did change Cloud a lot, and he's so much more fun to utilize in Rebirth, especially with a lot of his newer abilities. Up next, Hamaguchi talks about the Materia Guardian and why they chose to bring that enemy back and use them as the game's first opening boss. Hamaguchi says, "We felt that to make that a nicely balanced section in terms of gameplay, we needed a boss fight at the end of it. That meant we had to make a decision. Do we create a new enemy type, or is there something we could bring back from the original FF7? We very quickly realized that we wanted something from the original because it would delight fans to see something recognizable as the first boss. As we looked through the Mount Nebel area, we felt like the Materia Keeper, or Materia Guardian as it's named now, was the only real option, even though it originally appeared later in the game. It works so well thematically. You have the reactor where Mako is processed, and the life spring before that, so the idea of a creature that protects the life stream from intruders felt like a really great option. And I think that's a swap that actually works. I think most people, including myself, we were expecting that opening boss to be the dragon that we faced in the original FF7, the one that stops the truck in its path and you have to battle through it and Cloud's dying and Sephiroth's killing it in like 1 or 2 hits. That's what we all expected. That dragon actually does show up later in the game, which is pretty cool. You get Cloud, Tifa, and Yuffie as you're scaling Mount Nebel in this reactor. You find that dragon and you get to fight it, which was really nice. It was a lot smaller than I was expecting, but it was still a nice callback. But I think swapping out the dragon for the Materia Guardian does make a lot of sense the way Hamaguchi talks about it, because of how the lore implications work now for this creature. It's protecting these life springs and all of the Mako in it. So naturally, when you show up, it's like, oh, these intruders want my stuff. They want the materia, they want the Mako. I'm not going to let them have it. And I am very curious to see if in Remake Part 3, if there's another Materia Guardian that does show up, because again, in the original game, we don't fight that creature until much later on in the story. So it'd be cool to see that creature come back maybe in a different part of the world. Maybe it's souped up, a little bit bigger, more aggressive. I think that could be a really fun boss battle to revisit, because the developers are not afraid to bring back old bosses from Remake and re-implement them into Rebirth. We got to fight the Valkyrie again, for example, from Remake, and it came back in Rebirth, and that was a really fun revisit for a boss battle. And Hamaguchi does mention that they had concerns about bringing in the Materia Guardian because they thought it would be a little too close to the Scorpion Sentinel, which was the opening boss for 7 Remake, because they are very spider-like or insectoid-like. However, I think they did a really good job of differentiating the two enemies. The Scorpion Sentinel, it wasn't as mobile as the Materia Guardian, and obviously it's a mech, and the Materia Guardian is this really fast, powerful, agile creature that can subdue a character, that forces you to then switch to another character to really kind of learn the mechanics of how you're playing. You can't just brute force it with Sephiroth or brute force it with Cloud. The game really does a great job of slowly inching you into how magic works, how synergy skills and abilities work, how your limit breaks work, how you really do have to utilize all of the characters in your party to get through specific fights. Up next, Hamaguchi talks about how they worked hard to try and portray Sephiroth in a way that felt more grounded and serious when he eventually turns. Hamaguchi says, "I think this is one of the moments I'm proudest of in the whole flashback. That scene where you see Sephiroth reading through all the old books and documents and coming to the conclusion that he was created from Genova. The whole sequence shows the changes in Sephiroth, so it's really important. The way it was portrayed had to be perfect, and we worked really hard to ensure that it was. There were moments in the mansion in the original game that always looked a little comical to me. For example, there's a moment later in the story where Sephiroth flies up into the air, spins around, and flies through a corridor. So getting everything to feel more natural in 7 Rebirth was important to me. I'm really happy that he pointed that out because that specific section where Sephiroth just kind of floats in the air and does this really unnecessary flourish by flipping and then just zooming towards Cloud and knocking him on his butt was really silly, even in the OG game, and it has become a bit of a meme these days. But I think the way that it's depicted in this game is a lot darker and scarier, and seeing Sephiroth's slow descent into madness I think is really well done, especially with the voice work from Tyler Hoechlin, who is voicing Sephiroth Sephiroth. I think he does a pretty good job of making Sephiroth, in the first part of that flashback feel a little bit more like a human being with a personality and even cracks some jokes here and there. And then all of that gets stripped away as he starts to break and he realizes where he comes from. The tone in his voice becomes more monotonous, becomes deeper. He starts to lose a lot of that emotion other than like just pure anger at times. So I think they did a really good job there. Up next was the spiral staircase that we all knew and loved from the original FF7 and why it unfortunately didn't make it into Rebirth. Hamaguchi says, "We did actually try to make the spiral staircase and incorporate it into the game. The problem was that it just didn't feel right. When we tried to do it at the realistic scale of the building, it became very steep and very narrow. When you tried to go down it, the camera flew everywhere. It just felt really odd. We tried out a few things, but ultimately thought that if we were going to go with realistic proportions, it just doesn't work. That's why we ultimately made this decision to switch to using the elevator." Which was a little bit of a bummer. I know it's like one specific section of the game, but I just remember as a kid getting into the Shinra Mansion and getting access to the basement and going down that massive spiral staircase was so cool. And to see it kind of missing and being replaced with the elevator, it kind of sucks, but after learning the explanation, I completely understand why. You can't just put something in there for, fan service or nostalgia's sake. You kind of have to make sure that it works. And unfortunately, the spiral staircase just didn't work. And he also does mention how they wanted to build anticipation by having one of the doors in the basement be locked, because a lot of the fans would know that that is Vincent's resting place. So we know we can't get in there now, but later on we're going to come back and we're going to meet Vincent himself. And last but not least, they talk about the iconic imagery of Sephiroth burning Nibelheim to the ground and how they really wanted to do that this time around and make it even more impactful. Hamaguchi says, "This is such an iconic scene, and it was the major focus of that section of the game. Everything we did was to make sure we could depict that scene where Sephiroth disappears into the flames in the most dramatic way possible. When we got the first draft of the script from story and scenario writer Kazuhige Nojima, the whole sequence of events from Sephiroth discovering who he is through to when he disappears into the flames was done as cutscenes. And to be honest, it would have worked on a certain level. But what we really wanted to achieve was that feeling that Cloud, or the player, is desperately pursuing Sephiroth into the flames, to create that kind of emotional reaction. That's why we added extra scenes of Cloud desperately, painfully going through the burning village, worrying about his mother and her safety while still keeping an eye on Sephiroth. By making it all playable, I do think it elicits the right feeling we wanted for the scene. It does have emotional impact." And I actually really love that section of the game, and I think it was brilliant for them to take the demo and have the game basically end there when you're seeing the destruction of Nibelheim and Sephiroth just kind of walks away into the flames. I thought that was all really well done. And like Hamaguchi says, I think if you had left it as a cutscene, it would have worked, but allowing the player again to be a participant in what's happening and interact and actually walk around Nibelheim as Cloud is injured and just hobbling around because he's trying to make his way to his mom, and seeing all of these bodies strewn about and people that you had met earlier in the flashback who are now dead or dying, I think adds so much more impact to that specific section. And then once you actually make it to Cloud's home, the soldier you see on the ground who's reaching towards Cloud's house and saying "Mom," again, spoiler alert, but for those of you who have played the original, we know who that person is. It's Cloud, and that's part of Cloud's unreliable narrator. He doesn't remember that he was just an infantryman in that spot. He's putting himself in the shoes of Zack. And one of the biggest callbacks was the line from Cloud's mom, Claudia, about how he needs to run, he needs to live. We first heard those words in the beginning of 7 Remake from Sephiroth as he's basically taunting Cloud in an alley in Midgar, and those words didn't really make sense at first, but once we got that callback in Nibelheim and you realize, oh, Sephiroth is really messing with Cloud now because he's repeating the last words that Cloud's mom ever said to him, and Sephiroth is essentially just taking the Masamune, stabbing it into Cloud's heart and slowly turning it to really just kind of mess with him, and it is brutal. And I think that whole sequence does an even better job than the original game or subsequent recreations like Crisis Core to really showcase just how psychotic and scary Sephiroth has now become this time around. Because in that entire last section, Sephiroth is like this Terminator just going around murdering people. He's like Michael Myers just slashing indiscriminately. And they really do a fantastic job of building that up in the later half of the flashback. Now, the only issue I have with that section of the game is there's a moment where Cloud is knocked down on the ground and you have to use the DualSense triggers to crawl towards Sephiroth. That in itself is really well done. The pacing of how Cloud is crawling, it feels like you're spending an eternity trying to reach Sephiroth, and it really does depict that, anxiety aspect of that scenario. The only part that doesn't really work is that Sephiroth is standing with the villagers and they've got their guns pointed at him and they're not firing. He's just kind of standing there and they're standing with him and nothing's happening. I think that's either poor writing and directing, which would be rare because I think the writing and directing in this game is pretty damn incredible, but it could also have to do with the ratings board. I know that in video games, something that should seem simple, like pointing a gun at a character and firing at a certain distance, should be normal, but some of that stuff can really jack up the rating to go past a T rating and into the M territory. Although another way to look at that scenario is that a lot of times in life, people who have been through some really traumatic and harrowing events talk about how the event itself really only lasted for maybe like a minute or less, but in reality, as they're experiencing it, it feels like an eternity. So that could have been maybe one of the things they were trying to depict in that scenario as Cloud is crawling towards Sephiroth to try and stop him. It feels like this elongated stretch of time when in reality it's relatively short. So maybe they were trying to kind of depict that aspect of trauma, but I'm not quite sure. So I think they could have maybe done a slightly better job on that part. Maybe instead of having them just standing there pointing their guns at Sephiroth, maybe Sephiroth at this point has disarmed them, or he's slashed the guns to the point where they're not going to work anymore and they're all just standing there in a panic, in that fight or flight response, not sure what to do. Should we run? Should we try to fight? It just feels like this hopeless situation for those guys. So that's really my only knock on that section of the Nibelheim flashback in particular. I think they could have done a better job of depicting that section without making it feel kind of goofy with the guys just standing there pointing their guns at Sephiroth, not doing anything. But with that being said, that is the article itself. Again, I'll leave a link in the description below if you guys would like to read it for yourself, because I skipped over some stuff just for the sake of time. But I really do appreciate these articles from Square Enix where they sit down with Hamaguchi or Nomura or people just involved in this game to talk more about the behind the scenes aspect of building specific sections in Rebirth. I think it's fascinating to learn about this stuff and what decisions went into making this into the final product. So I very much appreciate it. But with that being said, I am Curious Corduroy. That is the video. Let me know in the comments down below what you guys thought of the Nibelheim flashback as a whole. Did you like every aspect of it? Were there certain things you didn't like? Maybe you're on the same page as me when it came to that section with Sephiroth and the villagers feeling a little awkward. I would love to hear what you guys have to say in the comments down below. I will see you guys in the next video. Please remember to always be excellent to one another.